Hi there. This lesson is intended to be an introduction to our unit on inductive inferences. And in addition to offering a couple of kind of overview comments about all inductive arguments and what makes them different from deductive arguments, I'm also going to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about bias. And while bias isn't the sort of thing that only influences and affects inductive arguments, it has a kind of especially strong impact on the way that we reason inductively. So this is a good opportunity to stop and think not only about inductive arguments generally, but specifically about how they're prone to the ways in which we might subconsciously make snap judgments. So to kick off this new unit on induction and the sorts of likely inferences that we make through inductive arguments, let's first take a look at some general criteria or properties that we can talk about that are common to all inductive arguments. Like, for starters, we should probably recognize that inductive arguments just work differently than deductive arguments do. And we get a sense of that, for starters, by recognizing that inductive arguments are never valid. They just can't be valid. It's not the kind of argument that they are. Validity is a condition that belongs to deductive arguments. But that doesn't necessarily mean that just because inductive arguments aren't valid, just because they don't maintain that standard that deductive arguments are held to, that doesn't mean that inductive arguments can't be good arguments. And I'll remind you that we had some similar concepts to validity and soundness for inductive arguments, and we referred to those concepts as strength and cogency. So we can talk about an inductive argument being strong or weak, rather than talking about it being valid or invalid. And a strong inductive argument is one where we would say that the conclusion is a very likely consequence of the premises. And reminder, again, a valid deductive argument says that if the premises are true, the conclusion must necessarily be true. But with induction, what we're saying is, okay, strength works a little bit differently than validity. If the premises are true in an inductively strong argument, then the conclusion is very likely to be true. Not necessarily true, just very likely to be true. And with that concept of strength, we can add on top of that this question of whether or not the premises are actually true. That was that additional wrinkle that we had between validity and soundness. A sound deductive argument is one that is valid and all of its premises are true. And when we're looking at induction, since strength works a little bit differently, we're not really going to be talking about soundness when we talk about inductive arguments. Instead, we want to talk about whether or not they're cogent. And a cogent inductive argument is one that is strong, and on top of that, the premises are all true, or all seem to be true, or all plausible. They can all be granted for the sake of discussion. Now, one of the big differences between talking about inductive arguments in terms of strength or weakness versus deductive arguments in terms of validity and invalidity is that while validity and invalidity are these binary concepts, either a deductive argument is valid or it's not. And if it's not valid, then it's invalid. With strength and weakness, we have a whole spectrum, a whole kind of spectrum of degrees of strength and weakness. So both strength and cogency are going to come in degrees. They're going to occupy this spectrum of strength and weakness and cogency and incogency in a way that deduction really doesn't have. Deduction has this kind of binary concepts of valid or invalid. Either the conclusion is necessarily entailed by the premises or it's not. Within inductive argument, we have these degrees of strength and cogency. And while we don't get a guarantee of the truth of the conclusion from our premises in an inductive argument, we do get that that conclusion seems to be likely on the basis of the evidence that we get in our premises, and likely is good enough to count as rational. We can't always hold out for absolute certainty when it comes to our beliefs. If we are holding out for absolute certainty, then we're going to end up just not believing very much, because there's not very much that we can know with that kind of absolute certainty. Most of our knowledge, most of our beliefs in our networks of beliefs are things that are probably true. Another way of talking about the difference between induction and deduction is to emphasize the way that inductive inferences are sometimes referred to as ampliative. That is to say that they take us to a conclusion that expands beyond what's already contained in the premises. Sometimes folks will point out that in deduction, all we really do is unpack what's said in our premises. We don't really necessarily say anything new. We might say it in different words, But the whole point of a deductively valid argument is that the truth of the conclusion is already contained in the truth of the premises. We've seen that in some of our formal methods that we've used to evaluate whether or not deductive arguments are valid. But we don't really quite have that going on in inductive arguments, and that's part of what makes them so interesting. I don't just unpack what my premises tell me. I try to reach beyond what my premises are able to tell me, to say something a little bit new, something that kind of increases my store of knowledge beyond what my premises could indicate with any sort of certainty. One way that we can think about how this works is by emphasizing the way that inductive arguments seem to seize upon some sort of pattern, some sort of pattern that's reliable enough to allow us to expect that that pattern is going to extend beyond where we've observed it so far, that it's going to perhaps extend universally to everything, or at least to like more things than what we've been able to observe and what we're able to account for in our premises. And the trick, of course, to evaluating whether or not these inductive inferences are done well or poorly is to evaluate the reliability of these patterns that inductive inferences seem to be seizing on. If they're very reliable, then we can totally expect them to extend beyond where we've observed them so far, and this is going to allow us to grow our knowledge, to engage in ampliative reasoning, ampliative inferences, rather than just simply unpacking what our premises tell us is true by the definitions of those terms that are contained within the premises. And we've already seen some forms of inductive arguments, some kind of styles or kind of basic structures that we can recognize in inductive arguments, where we can see this notion of a pattern that's identified and an attempt to extend that pattern beyond where we've seen it thus far. So we have identified statistical syllogism as a style of inductive inference where somebody is arguing from some general rule to a particular case. And that's not really that different than some of our deductive syllogisms that we've seen, but in this case, what we see is something that's a little bit more probabilistic. For example, if I had a first premise in this argument that said all A's are B's and X is an A, then therefore X is necessarily, definitely going to be a B. That would be a deductively valid argument. But as soon as I soften that general rule from all A's or B's to most A's or B's, I've moved into a completely different sort of a territory. I'm no longer making an inference on the basis of deduction. I'm making one on the basis of induction. So most A's are B's. We recognize that X is an A. So therefore, X is probably going to be a B. It's not guaranteed the same way that it would be guaranteed if my first premise was all A's are B's. So that pattern that's being seized upon here, that we're hoping is reliable enough to get us to our conclusion with some reasonable degree of confidence, is this idea that most A's are B's. That's the pattern. And now, if that's a very strong pattern, then this is a very strong argument. If it's a weak pattern, then it's going to be a weak argument. Similarly, but with a kind of a distinct style of inference going on here, we have what is sometimes referred to as enumerative induction or enumerative generalization, or perhaps inductive generalization. And these are where we're arguing from particular cases to a general rule. It actually goes the opposite direction of statistical syllogism. It's how we get the kinds of general rules that we can use in a statistical syllogism. Those rules don't just fall out of the sky. We have to make them, and we make them from observing lots of particular cases. So for example, I might have an argument that identifies some particular case X is a case of A and B. Y is also a particular case of A and B. Z is also an A and it's also a B. Therefore, on the basis of these particular cases, I might want to draw an inference that most A's seem to be B's. Now, whether or not that's a reliable argument, whether or not that's an argument that is strong, is dependent on whether or not the pattern that we've identified in our premises is a strong and reliable pattern. Now, on the basis of what we have here in this argument, it looks like, maybe that's not very strong. I only have 3 particular cases that I'm trying to generalize from. But this could be the sort of argument that could be good, depending on how strong the pattern that I'm identifying is. Last but certainly not least, we talked about this other form of induction, analogical induction, sometimes referred to as argument by analogy. And rather than going from a general rule to a particular case, or from particular cases to a general rule, the way that statistical syllogism and enumerative induction work, analogies argue from one particular case to another particular case on the basis of some sort of similarity between those cases. So we can see the argument structure here for an argument by analogy that says I have some particular case x, and it has properties p, q, r, and s. I have another particular case y that has properties p, q, and r. And that similarity between x and y on properties p, q, and r seems like it might be able to suggest that maybe, probably, maybe, depending on how strong this pattern is, maybe I might be able to get away with saying that y probably also has property s. Now again, these are not guaranteed. The conclusions are not absolutely certain on the basis of our premises the way that they are in deduction, but that's not necessarily a flaw of these sorts of arguments. It's more of just kind of the nature of induction, the nature of trying to reason about things that aren't absolutely certain and instead are things that are known or believed on the basis of probabilistic patterns. And this introduces another big difference between induction and deduction, namely that with deduction, we already have everything that we need in order to determine whether or not the argument is valid or invalid, as long as we have all of the premises and the conclusion that's trying to be drawn from those premises. But with inductive arguments, the strength or the cogency of these arguments might change depending on how much information we have. And as we get more or less relevant information, the cogency of our arguments might also get higher or lower. This is usually what people refer to by the principle, or sometimes they'll talk about this as the rule of total evidence, that the strength of an inductive argument doesn't just rely on the information that we're given in the premises of that argument. Instead, the strength of that argument is going to rely on all available information. For example, it seems a reasonable sort of a general rule to say that most people who are musicians are people who can read music. So most musicians are people who can read music. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. Let's just assume it for the sake of discussion here. So if I do think that most musicians can read music, and I know that somebody is a musician, it seems like I've got good reason to suppose that perhaps they might be able to read music. So let's try an argument like this. This is a statistical syllogism that starts with a general rule that most musicians can read music. And assuming that that's true, and assuming that it's also true that our friend Ringo here is a musician, it seems like we've got good reason to draw the conclusion that Ringo can probably read music. However, if we get a little bit more information about this scenario, not information that says that any of these premises are false, but maybe just additional information. For example, let's say that while it's true that most people who are musicians are also people who can read music, certain types of musicians maybe won't follow that pattern. Certain types of musicians might be more likely to not be able to read music. For example, drummers are kind of notorious for not necessarily being able to read music. Now, drummers are musicians, but they're a specific class of musicians, and in that specific class, the pattern seems to be different than it is for musicians at large. So let's say we start with this premise instead, that most drummers cannot read music, and we identify that Ringo, while we know that he's a musician, let's say we add a little bit more specificity to this knowledge that Ringo's a musician. Let's say specifically that he's a drummer. Well, if most drummers cannot read music and Ringo is a drummer, then by statistical syllogism, it seems like we've got good reason to suppose that Ringo can probably not read music. So here we have two statistical syllogisms that seem like they're equally strong in terms of their structure. All of their premises appear to be true, or at least the sorts of things that we could suppose for the sake of conversation. None of the premises contradict each other, except for these two conclusions. One argument is coming to the conclusion that Ringo probably can read music. The other one's coming to the conclusion that Ringo probably cannot read music. And this second argument is the more reliable one because it includes more information. It gives us more specific information about Ringo. We know that he's a musician by saying that he's a drummer, but we know what kind of musician he is by identifying him as a drummer. So again, as we get more or less relevant information, the cogency of the arguments that we're examining can very well be changed. The evaluation of inductive arguments isn't the sort of thing that can be restricted to just the premises and the conclusion that are given in the argument, we kind of have to expand our evaluation of these arguments to include all of the available relevant information that we might have. And another corollary of this is the recognition that what counts as reasonable, what counts as well supported by reason, actually might change as we get more new information. It may very well be reasonable to believe one thing on one day, and then on another day, if new information comes to light, what would be reasonable to believe could change. That's not to say that the truth of the matter has changed, it's only to say that what is reasonable to believe might have changed. And if this isn't complicated enough, and it's already pretty complicated, much more complicated than deductive arguments were, we can offer another complication that'll kind of make our evaluation of inductive arguments even more difficult. And this is this recognition that while we're identifying that the conclusions of our inductive arguments are likely to be true, provided that our premises are true, that is to say, if our inductive inferences are strong ones, there's this kind of floating question of how likely is likely enough for me to believe something. Certainly, if something is guaranteed to be true, that's probably enough certainty for me to believe it. But what if it's only 99% chance that it's true? What if it's a 90% chance that it's true? What if it's a 51% chance that it's true? How likely does something have to be before it's a good idea for me to believe it? And we'd remarked earlier that it just doesn't seem reasonable to hold out for certainty in all cases, but that does leave this hanging question of where the threshold for believability actually lies. And it seems like that threshold might move around depending on what's on the line in our inference. In some circumstances, we might have an awful lot on the line, and maybe it makes more sense to be a bit more cautious. Maybe in other instances, there's a little bit less on the line, and we can afford to be more bold. Sometimes it makes more sense to be bold in our inferences. Sometimes it makes more sense to be more cautious. This seems like it might be situationally contingent. For example, we can consider kind of a gambling scenario like this one, where I offer you the opportunity to play a game where you get to roll a single die, a fair die, and the game is if you roll anything besides a 6, you win, and if you roll a 6, you lose, and you're betting $10 on this. If you put the $10 down, if you roll anything but a 6, you'll get your $10 back plus another $10, and if you roll a 6, you'll lose your $10. You have a 1 in 6 chance of being wrong and a 5 in 6 chance of being right or winning if you decide to play this game. Is it reasonable to play this game? And it seems like it is. This game is a pretty good bet. Over time, you would make a whole lot of money playing this game. You would lose sometimes, but you'd win way more often than you'd lose, probably approximately 5 times more often than you would lose. Well, if we think that this is a reasonable game to play on the basis of a 1 in 6 chance of being wrong and a 5 in 6 chance of being right in deciding to play it, maybe we can consider other sorts of games that have the same odds, like Russian roulette. We put a single bullet in a revolver with 6 chambers, we spin the barrel, we close it up, and put the gun to your head and pull the trigger. You have a 1 in 6 chance of losing this game and a 5 in 6 chance of winning. Is it reasonable to play? Well, it has the same odds as the dice game that we were just looking at. Is it equally reasonable? No. It seems clearly to not be equally reasonable to play Russian roulette as to play that dice gambling scenario that I described earlier, and that's because what's on the line in these two games is very, very different. In the first instance, what you stand to gain is $10, what you stand to lose is $10. And in the second instance, what you stand to lose is your life. And what you stand to gain is, I don't know, sometimes folks might say, well, if you win, you gain your life, but you kind of had your life even if you didn't play. So it seems like maybe there's very little to win in the game of Russian roulette and a whole lot to lose. So whereas in this one, what there was to win and what there was to lose was approximately equal. And that changes what my threshold for likelihood is in whether or not it's reasonable to take a chance on probably winning, on probably being right. In both of these cases, I'm probably going to win this game if I play. But in this case, a 5 and 6 probability is good enough to make it reasonable, and in the Russian roulette case, it's not. And that's because of what's on the line. We should be asking ourselves, with all inductive inferences, what's at stake if I'm right versus if I'm wrong? To think about that carefully, and that's going to help us try to figure out where that threshold for believability is with respect to likelihood. Okay, so at this point, it seems like all of our inductive inferences are like crazy complicated. We have to consider this whole spectrum of likeliness and unlikeliness. We have to recognize that how strong or how weak an inductive argument is not just contingent on the information that we get in the premises and the conclusion of the argument, but like all available information that we might have available to us. And on top of that, this question of where the threshold for believability is on any kind of likely inference is contingent on what's at stake. So these are some really complex arguments to try to evaluate. And given how complex these judgments can be, we might start to wonder where anybody finds the time to think this carefully or this rationally about any of our decisions, let alone all of our decisions. Even something as simple as going to the grocery store and picking out a box of cereal seems almost insurmountably complex when we try to think about all of the factors that we would need to consider in order to critically and rationally come to that sort of judgment. We'd have to think about the nutritional value, for example, on all of the boxes and like the many different kinds of cereal that are there on the cereal aisle. We'd have to think about the price per unit volume or the price per weight. We'd have to maybe think about the labor practices of the companies involved in producing the cereals. There's a lot to think about. And on top of that, I'd have to try to think about, so what's on the line if I'm right versus what's on the line if I'm wrong about making my choice in cereal. This is like more than anybody could possibly think about when they're in the cereal aisle of the grocery store. If they did try to take all of those things into account, they just wouldn't get their shopping done. And the truth is that we don't buy cereal on the basis of rational, critical, careful judgments. We don't make many of our decisions on that sort of basis. Instead, I buy my cereal much like I make most of the choices in my life, on a kind of a gut level, without thinking critically or carefully. I'll perhaps narrow down all of the choices that I have to look at in the cereal aisle by first gravitating towards the cereals that I've seen commercials for on television. Or perhaps I'll gravitate towards the cereals that I ate when I was a kid and have a fond association with. Or perhaps I'll gravitate towards the cereals that have, attractive looking boxes or something like that. These are the sort of like non-critical, non-rational factors that are going to creep into the decisions that I make about cereal and a lot of other sorts of judgments that I might make, and help make those decisions and those judgments a little bit more manageable, and the sorts of things that I can make judgments about a lot quicker. One way of thinking about the way that we make these kinds of snap gut judgments is to think of them as emotional judgments, or to think of the emotions themselves as a kind of rough and ready heuristic that we use for making judgments on the basis of past experiences and our feelings that we associate with those past experiences. For example, we might consider a scenario where I'm confronted with a dog who's kind of behaving like we see in this picture, with mouth open, teeth bared, ears back. And if I'm in this sort of situation, we can, I think, hopefully see this in an even more vivid way than the task of trying to pick out which cereal to buy. This is a scenario that I'm going to have to assess and come to a judgment about really, really quickly. And if I have to, try to think about all of the available information, try to evaluate what's going on in the background as well as the foreground, try to think about, well, the dog is showing his teeth. That could mean that he's smiling. Maybe he wants to play. It could mean that he's angry and displaying aggression. These are all like mental processes, careful, critical mental processes that I might go through and might lead me to some sort of reliable judgment or reliable conclusion, but I just don't have enough time to parse the situation in that way. Instead, what I need is for my attention to immediately be drawn to this dog and the way that it's behaving, and to immediately, perhaps without even consciously thinking about anything, immediately come to some sort of judgment that this this is a dangerous situation and I need to back up and give the dog some space. Perhaps we might even think that that judgment should be reached in a reflexive way, almost subconsciously. And this is one thing that emotions are really good at. They're really good at providing us a means of making judgments in a really fast way where I can synthesize a whole lot of information from a complex scenario and I can reduce it to a manageable couple of things that I focus on and come to a very quick, actionable judgment on the basis of the feeling that I get from all of these various stimuli. But as much as emotions can offer us some reliable means of coming to really fast judgments, it's also the case that emotional heuristics aren't always reliable. They're kind of, as I suggested in the previous slide, they're rough and ready. They work sometimes, they might even work most of the time, but they don't work all of the time, and they can potentially lead us astray. For example, consider this dog in this image, who seems to have made an emotional assessment of the situation that it's in. It looks like this dog is afraid of this situation, and it's understandable why it would be afraid. It's got its paw in somebody's hand. That's kind of a vulnerable position for the dog to be in, and especially if that person is unfamiliar and it's not sure what's going on, totally understandable that this is the kind of scenario that a dog would read as worthy of a fear response. But if, for example, what's going on is the dog's nails are being trimmed or the dog is undergoing some sort of veterinary procedure, even though its fear response is understandable, it's the sort of thing that we might think to ourselves, well, if the dog was capable of rational thought, then maybe it would understand that this is not the sort of thing to be afraid of. I've often wished this for my own pets, that they seem to have a traumatic experience when I take them to the vet, and I wish I could explain to them that this is actually for their own good, that there's nothing to be afraid of. I wish that I was able to, instead of having my pets rely on their emotional heuristics, I wish I could access some rational faculties to explain what's going on and allow them to think about the situation critically. Historically, emotional responses like this have gotten a little bit of a bad rap. They're considered as something that is maybe incompatible with critical, rational thought, but I don't think that that's entirely true. Emotional heuristics can be reliable, and there are legitimate appeals to emotion that we might make that are the sorts of things that we've begun to kind of glimpse into, this way in which emotions can provide us with the ability to make judgments in very, very fast ways in very, very complex scenarios that would be difficult to parse through careful, rational, critical means. So we need to be able to distinguish between a fallacious appeal to emotion, that would be some sort of scenario where my emotional response is leading me astray, is actually perhaps obscuring important information, or is distracting me from important information that I should be using to come to my judgment, versus legitimate appeals to emotion, where the emotion is actually drawing my attention to some important, crucial piece of information that I need in order to come to a reliable judgment. This idea that our emotional judgments and our rational, critical judgments are the sorts of things that are potentially in conflict with one another, but also potentially complementary, is not exactly new. It goes back thousands of years. But in the past 3 or 4 decades, careful study into the ways in which we make those snap, emotional, gut-level judgments have really exploded. And a lot of that is attributable to work done in the late 1970s and early 1980s by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. The basic insight of that work has been popularized in Kahneman's best-selling book Thinking Fast and Slow, and it outlines 2 systems of thought that are going on in everybody's brain, 2 parallel systems of thought, one that operates fast and another one that operates in a slow sort of a way. System 1, or the fast system, is the system that makes those emotional judgments, those kind of heuristic judgments that are done really, really quickly, and also made in a sort of an automatic, effortless sort of a way, and at the limits of our consciousness, sometimes completely unconsciously. And because we have so many complex decisions to make, a lot of our everyday decisions can and are done by this sort of system 1 fast emotional thought. And while it is fast, and while it isn't very expensive in terms of mental energy and attention, it is a little bit error prone, as we were just noting. Comparatively, our system 2 thinking, which we might think about in terms of our rational critical faculties, this is a very slow way of making judgments, especially compared to system 1. It takes a tremendous amount of effort to make judgments in this way, and that's something that I would expect that anybody who's taking this class is aware of. The sorts of formal methods that we were using to analyze deductive judgments in our previous unit, I think, revealed just how much effort is required in order to make judgments in that way. This slow, effortful thinking is done explicitly and consciously, and it tends to be more reliable than System 1. But because it's so slow, it's not the sort of thing that we can use for our everyday decisions. It's the sort of thing that we break out on special occasions. The problem that Kahneman and Tversky and many others have been trying to crack is to try to better understand how System 1 works so that we might better be able to discriminate between the circumstances where System 1 thinking is reliable and those circumstances where System 1 thinking is not very reliable, where it might lead us astray, or in other words, when we are making legitimate appeals to emotion or when we might be making fallacious appeals to emotion. And as it turns out, this research program has revealed a lot of ways in which our System 1 thinking works basically the same way for everybody. We can identify the patterns, these unconscious patterns, in the ways that most, if not all humans, are able to make snap, fast, gut-level emotional judgments. So we can talk about those sorts of judgments as emotional judgments. We can talk about them as operating according to heuristics. We can call them System 1 thinking, as Kahneman does. But another term that we frequently use to talk about the ways in which we're predisposed to make judgments according to System 1 thinking is to call those structures biases. And a bias is really nothing more than a predisposition to judge in a certain way. Bias, I think, kind of like emotion, has gotten a little bit of a bad rap. I think people have a tendency to think about biases as always bad, that it's always undesirable to have biases. But hopefully in what we've been talking about here, we get this sense that having an automatic predisposition to judge in certain ways is the sort of thing that makes fast System 1 thinking possible. And it's not only occasionally reliable, it's not only potentially desirable, it is in fact necessary in order for us to be able to make the sorts of judgments and the numbers of judgments that we make on an everyday basis. Some of those biases are explicit. I'm explicitly aware of my predisposition to judge in a certain way. These are conscious beliefs that I have that set me up in order to make judgments in one way versus another. But the sorts of biases that folks like Kahneman and Tversky and other behavioral economists and psychologists are trying to get some insight into are what we might call implicit biases. And these are predispositions to judge that are unconscious. Sometimes folks refer to these as A-leafs in contrast to explicit B-leafs. They're perhaps something different than a belief. They're maybe even a little bit more primitive than a belief because they're operating at this unconscious level. Many of the fruits of this research project of looking into and trying to analyze the way that our System 1 judgments are made can be found in the identification of these implicit biases. For example, one implicit bias that's shared by all humans is known as confirmation bias. Confirmation bias refers to our tendency to seek out evidence that supports our prior beliefs and to ignore evidence that undercuts it. This predisposition to come to judgments that are consistent with our prior beliefs is the sort of thing that we've seen before, and not necessarily as a bad thing. We talked about this in terms of a principle of conservatism that should be balanced with a principle of revisability in a previous lesson. And that principle of conservatism basically articulated this idea that our prior beliefs, if they've been successful and reliable thus far, should be the sorts of things that we should be hesitant to give up, and we should perhaps give them a bit of a privileged position in our minds. But if taken to excess, that kind of bias, that principle of conservatism or this confirmation bias, can lead to a kind of a dogmatic closed-mindedness. And perhaps even worse, it's an unconscious dogmatic closed-mindedness. We're not even fully aware of all of the ways in which we are ignoring evidence that is contrary to our previous beliefs, and the way that we're maybe exclusively focusing on evidence that supports our prior beliefs. For example, suppose that there's somebody who believes that their horoscope gives an accurate depiction of what their future is going to be like. That person might read their horoscope every day, and they might selectively attend to all of the successful predictions that their horoscope makes, but also on top of that, ignore all of the ways in which their horoscope fails to predict what happens to them or fails to accurately describe what's going on in their lives. And because of that confirmation bias, as this person continues to read their horoscope, they'll continue to get what seems like more and more evidence that their horoscope is accurate, despite the fact that they're getting at least as much evidence that their horoscope isn't accurate, and they're just not really attending to it. And again, this is a feature of everybody's thinking, everybody's System 1 thinking. We all have a preference for information that's consistent with our prior beliefs, and we all have a tendency to just kind of bracket and ignore new information that just does not compute with our prior understanding of the world. Here's another bias that's shared by everybody, another predisposition to make judgments in certain ways. It's referred to frequently as availability bias, or sometimes the availability heuristic. And this refers to our tendency to emphasize the importance of events that are more readily recalled in our memory, or kind of like more available to our attention. This includes a whole zoo of more specific kinds of biases. For example, recency bias, which refers to our tendency to emphasize events that happened recently and to maybe de-emphasize events that happened a longer time ago. And that's the sort of thing, again, that it's understandable. We see why it is that our minds might work this way. It's the sort of thing that could be beneficial to us to think in terms of what the latest information tells us rather than what old information tells us. But it's also the sort of thing that might lead us astray if the events that we've experienced recently are a little local hiccup or are somehow otherwise not representative of what we can expect in most situations. That privileging of more recent events over older events can sometimes be combined with a similar sort of a privileging of more emotionally intense experiences in a bias that is sometimes referred to as the peak end heuristic. This refers to our tendency to kind of make a gestalt judgment about an experience that has unfolded over a long period of time by kind of roughly averaging what our most recent experience with that event is, what the end of that experience was like, and what our most intense emotional experience over that whole duration was. For example, a class is the sort of thing that's an event that unfolds over an entire semester, and students are frequently asked to give an evaluation of what a semester-long course was like at the end of the course. And it's pretty demonstrable that the way that most people make that judgment is by making a rough average between the way that the course ended, and what their emotional resonance with the last couple of weeks of the class were like, and what their most intense emotional experience was like. And again, this is understandable. We can see that this is a very convenient way of taking a very complex event and boiling it down to just a couple of things to think about and to give us a kind of a rough and ready heuristic for understanding a large, complex thing. But it's also the sort of thing that can lead us astray. And in fact, an instructor that understands that students are going to evaluate their class according to a peak end heuristic can strategically design their class so that there's one very intense experience at some point during the semester that's a positive, intense experience, and they can make sure that they end the class on a positive note as well. And if they have those two things, they can actually get away with having the course be not that good for the rest of the semester, and students will still have a tendency to evaluate that course favorably. Another version of availability bias is the way in which we can sometimes overrepresent the frequency of events that are especially noticeable and underemphasize the frequency of events that are less noticeable. This is sometimes called the toupee fallacy or the bad toupee fallacy because it attempts to explain why somebody might come to the conclusion that all toupees, or even most toupees, are not very good, are easily noticed. Somebody might wonder, like, why is it that people wear toupees? A toupee, by the way, is like false hair that you wear on the top of your head to cover a bald spot. And somebody might think to themselves that, like, toupees are so obvious, they're so poorly done, they're not fooling anybody. They might wonder why it is that anybody tries to wear a toupee in the first place. And we might respond to that person by noting that, well, the easily spotted toupees are easy to spot, and you notice those whenever you see them, but how many toupees are you just not noticing? How many of these toupees are passing as real hair? And the truth is, you have no idea how many of those toupees there are. And because of that, you overrepresent the frequency of bad toupees and underrepresent the frequency of so-called good toupees. We might think of another version of this where somebody comes to the judgment that, something like American tourists are loud and obnoxious. And we might point out to them that, well, that judgment has this tendency to maybe fall prey to an availability bias, that the loud and obnoxious American tourists are easy to notice. They are very available to our attention. But the quiet, polite American tourists, those folks are harder to find. Not because they don't exist, not because there aren't very many of them, but because they're just not as noticeable, not as available to our attention. And this leads us to make a lot of judgments that are irrational, and predictably irrational. The way that our minds kind of depart from what our critical rational faculties would tell us is the sort of thing that is relatively consistent, relatively universal across all thinking subjects. And again, I should emphasize the fact that this is something that all of us have to deal with. None of us are magically immune to these biases. This is a part of how all human minds work. And to ignore that is to fall prey to another bias that is referred to as bias blindness. Unfortunately, in addition to the fact that we're all inclined to be irrational in some predictable ways, one of those predictable irrationalities is the assumption that we are somehow more reasonable and less prone to bias and irrationality than other people are. This is actually one of my greatest fears in this course, that in teaching students a little bit about critical thinking, some students might leave the class thinking that they are just rational people, and other people are just less rational than they are. When the truth is that all of us are irrational most of the time. We just don't have the temporal resources and the mental bandwidth in order to be rational all of the time, in order to engage our system two thinking all of the time. It's a special sort of a thing. We only occasionally break into that critical system two rational thought, and most of us are, in fact, making most of our judgments on the basis of rough and ready emotional heuristics and biases. And while we could go on and on just identifying different sorts of implicit biases, let's look at just one more for the sake of rounding out this little tour of some examples of subconscious biases. Let's take a look at something called the Backfire Effect. This is actually a very kind of depressing bias that affects all thinking subjects. And it refers to our tendency to cling even more tenaciously to a belief when we're presented with contrary evidence. This is a phenomenon that's gotten a lot of attention recently in response to climate denialism, sometimes in response to vaccine skepticism, that when we try to provide evidence to folks who think that climate change is a hoax, or who think that the COVID-19 pandemic is a hoax, or that vaccines are dangerous. When we present them with this evidence, they actually dig their heels in even more and cling even more tenaciously to the belief that they had before they were presented with the evidence. Presenting them with evidence and making arguments actually seems to backfire. It makes the situation worse. Recent neurological studies of this phenomenon have revealed that this is a particularly strong effect when it has to do with beliefs that are central to somebody's identity. And in fact, what we see in somebody's brain when the backfire effect is happening is that they read the presentation of contrary evidence as a threat to themselves. They have almost a fight or flight response. If you've ever felt that sort of fight or flight response when you've been in a disagreement with somebody, maybe you get a sense of how it is that somebody might read a disagreement, read somebody bringing them evidence that's contrary to a belief that they've expressed as a personal threat, as something that they need to defend against, and as the sort of thing that they might be inclined to discount because it's coming from a source that the person is regarding as hostile. And with this particular bias, along with all other biases, one of the even more depressing bits of news that has been revealed the more we study this sort of stuff is that being aware of your own biases really doesn't help much in being able to avoid those biases. As I noted before, awareness of your own biases requires that you're already in a sort of a critical, rational attitude, and that requires some effort. That requires special occasions to get into that mindset. The default mindset for most of us is to be in system one thought, to not be critical of our own thought process, to not even be particularly aware of our own thought processes. And so just knowing that you have these biases isn't enough to prevent you from falling prey to them, because they're always at work whenever you're not paying attention, whenever your rational faculties are being overridden or short-circuited, or when you just don't have the energy to put into the slow, careful, critical, rational thought that would be required in order to take that sort of metacognitive critical stance towards your own thought process. So what can we do then about all of these implicit biases that we have? If simply knowing about them isn't enough to help us avoid error, then what's the point of even knowing about these implicit biases? One of the takeaways is that we need to make an effort. We need to be aware of circumstances when I might be prone to biased thinking, and I need to make an effort to slow my thinking down, to switch over from system one thinking into system two thinking. The more aware I am of my implicit biases, the more likely that I'm going to be able to switch over from system one into system two thinking and be aware of ways in which my implicit biases might be leading me astray. And I can reduce the amount of effort that's required to do that by developing habits, skeptical habits, in fact. We might want to practice and habituate having a little skeptical voice in our head that acknowledges all of the ideas that we come to, all of the judgments that we make, but follows that up with a yes, but how might that be wrong? We might even be inclined to practice what's known as devil's advocacy, although I should point out that that's the sort of thing that can be abused. We need to make sure that devil's advocacy is deployed in a productive and good faith sort of a way, that we're not simply being a naysayer. We're recognizing that we might need to have a little moment where we take on the position of a potential naysayer in order to make sure that we're not being led primarily by our system one implicit biases. I might also make sure that I develop communities of thought that are diverse communities of thought and inquiry, to make sure that I'm surrounded by people who have different perspectives than I do. And so when I come to judgments that are made on the basis of my system one biases and emotional heuristics, there's a good chance that there's somebody in my community who might see things a little bit differently and might cue me to the possibility that I might have to get out of system one thinking and into system two, critical, metacognitive, careful, rational thought. If I'm aware of a particular circumstance where I might be especially prone to bias, I can also sometimes take steps to make sure that I blind myself to any biasing cues, if that's possible. For example, I might be on a hiring committee and I might recognize that even though I have explicit beliefs that both male and female candidates are equally good candidates for this job, I might recognize that despite that explicit belief, I might still have an implicit bias that prefers one gender to another, or that prefers one race to another, or that prefers any other sort of biasing cue to another sort of a biasing cue. And one way that I can make sure that I don't get led astray by that is making sure that all of the applications are blinded to all of the things that might cue my bias. So I look at these applications without any regard to gender, without any regard to race, without any regard to any other cues that might lead me to make unreliable judgments. And last but not least, we can actually actively try to rewire our brains a little bit. We can train ourselves to have different kinds of emotional associations with different kinds of cues. These are sometimes referred to as debiasing training. And these are the sorts of things in which I would seek out experiences that are contrary to my implicit bias. For example, if I had a phobia, an irrational phobia of spiders or heights, I might put myself in situations where I'm going to be confronted with a spider or with heights, but they're going to be positive experiences. They're going to be safe experiences. They're going to be the sorts of experiences where I might be inclined to begin to extinguish the negative association that I have with a spider or with heights or whatever the thing that I have a phobia of. And it's important for us to keep these lessons and these strategies in mind as we continue to learn about new ways to critically and rationally evaluate inductive arguments. The remainder of this unit is going to take us on exactly that journey. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, bias doesn't only affect inductive arguments, but remember that inductive arguments hinge on pattern recognition, and an awful lot of the ways in which we recognize patterns really boils down to kind of System 1 Gestalt gut level recognition of a pattern. Inductive arguments also require that we not only attend to the information that's given to us in the premises of an argument, but that we attend to all of the available relevant information. And what we find relevant, what we find significant, what we find noteworthy, and what's even available to our attention is the sort of thing that's easily influenced by implicit bias. And last but not least, we talked about how inductive arguments always have this kind of implicit question of how likely is likely enough for me to believe the conclusion. And that comes down to a question of what's on the line, how bold and risky we want our inferences to be versus how safe and cautious we want our inferences to be. And that weighing of risk and security is also the sort of thing that's easily influenced by implicit bias. So as we explore the subsequent lessons in this unit and start to investigate some methods for evaluating the strength of inductive arguments, keep this in mind that these critical, rational tools that we're developing only really work if you're able to get out of System 1 thinking and into System 2 thinking in the first place. And that requires quite a lot of vigilance and habituation. I look forward to seeing you in those lessons.